January 14th, 1944, Guadalcanal's forward airstrip steamed under the harsh South Pacific sun as the monsoon clouds finally broke. The entire strip smelled like gasoline, tropical mud, and hot metal. Rows of tired-looking P-38 Lightnings sat in the open like wounded animals recovering after a long fight. Ground crews moved slowly, weighed down by exhaustion from endless Japanese air raids. But one mechanic stood apart from the others, a thin, grease-covered corporal named Everett Ev Mallory, staring at the tail section of a Lightning as if it were about to reveal a secret. Mallory wasn't a pilot, ace, or officer. He was just a quiet mechanic from rural Montana who used to fix tractors in the snow. But over the past few weeks, he had watched pilot after pilot complain that the P-38 couldn't turn with Japanese Zeros. The Lightning was fast, powerful, and deadly in a dive, but when a close-in turning fight broke out, the Zero always curled inside it like a knife. The squadron had lost 2 aces that week in tight-turn engagements they should never have attempted. Their deaths didn't sit right with Mallory. Something he read in the crash notes started eating at him. Something small, easily overlooked. A momentary lag in control response under high G turns. He had been thinking about it for days. He'd run his fingers along the control cables, checked pulleys, adjusted tension. Everything looked perfect on the ground. But in the air, under stress, the main cables seemed to slacken by just a hair. Millimeters that meant milliseconds, and milliseconds that meant the difference between surviving and spiraling into the sea. Mallory couldn't let it go. It gnawed at him through every shift, every meal, every moment he lay awake at night, listening to rain pound the tent roof. Earlier in the week, he had heard one pilot, Lieutenant Jack Harlow, say something that sparked his obsession. "Feels like the controls fight you, like the cables go loose for a moment when you're pulling hard." Loose. That word had stuck to Mallory's mind like glue. In the darkness behind the tent line, he began experimenting with scrap cables and discarded engine wire. He pulled, tightened, wrapped, adjusting tension to see if he could keep a cable from ever slackening under load. The idea was so simple it felt stupid. A secondary steel wire, flexible but strong, woven through the guides, designed only to apply micro-tension, just enough to prevent that tiny, deadly lag. He had laughed at himself the first time he said it out loud. A stupid wire trick. Now, as the sun rose over Guadalcanal, he crouched beneath the tail of a real P-38, threading that same thin steel wire through the rudder control pathway. His fingers trembled as he worked. If he over-tightened it, a pilot could lose control and die. If someone caught him, he would be court-martialed before sundown. And if the wire snapped mid-flight, it could lash back into the main cable and sever it. But if it worked, if it actually worked, pilots might survive turning fights they had no business winning. He continued threading until he heard heavy boots approach. Staff Sergeant Ray McAllister, his crew chief, stopped beside him and squinted. "Ev, what are you doing?" McAllister asked. Mallory froze. "Just tightening things," he said, trying to sound casual. "You look like you just buried a body," McAllister muttered. "Get some water. You're shaking." Mallory watched him walk off, then quickly tied off the last knot, checked tension one final time, and closed the panel. His heart thumped loudly in his ears. The modification was done. The trick was locked inside. By noon, the pilots emerged from their briefing tent. Lieutenant Jack Harlow, tall, confident, and always grinning like he knew something the devil didn't, jogged straight toward his plane. He slapped a hand against the fuselage, then looked at Mallory. "You did a full tension check." "Everything's tight," Mallory said. "Better than tight." Harlow nodded and climbed in. The twin Allison engines thundered to life, sending dust swirling across the strip. Mallory stepped back, palms sweaty. As the Lightning taxied forward, for the first time he was afraid of a plane he'd worked on. He whispered under his breath, "Please hold together. Please don't kill him." Hours passed before the squadron returned from patrol. No enemy contact, no dogfights, just a routine flight, perfect for testing. As soon as Harlow landed, he jumped out of the cockpit and marched toward Mallory with fire in his eyes. Mallory braced to be yelled at. Instead, Harlow grabbed him by the shoulders. "What did you do to my plane?" Mallory's stomach dropped. Then Harlow's face exploded into a grin. "She rolls like she's alive. No lag, none. I barely touch the stick and she snaps right in. I damn near snapped my neck doing a test roll." Mallory let out a long, shaky breath he didn't realize he'd been holding. "It works," Harlow whispered. "Ev, whatever you did, do it to every lightning here." Mallory stared at him. This wasn't a joke. Harlow meant it. "If I do this on every plane and someone catches it—" "They won't," Harlow said softly. "And even if they do, we'll cover you. This could keep us alive." Mallory hesitated only a moment longer. Then he nodded. That night, while officers slept and the island lay drenched in moonlight, Mallory worked alone with a toolkit and a spool of wire. He slipped between parked P-38s like a ghost, opening panels, weaving tensioning wire through each aircraft's control path. His fingertips bled from pulling the steel tight. His eyes stung. Sweat dripped down his face as he whispered instructions to himself in the dark. 1 plane done, then 2, then 4. By dawn, 7. By the next sunset, all 12 Lightnings in the 339th Fighter Squadron had the stupid wire trick. Mallory barely slept. He barely ate. But as he stood on the strip the following morning, he felt a strange calm settle over him. The pilots walked to their planes, unaware that a mechanic's desperate midnight gamble was now the only thing separating them from disaster. None of them knew the Japanese were coming. And they were coming in force, more zeros than any raid in weeks. What would happen next would shock every man on that airstrip, including Ev Mallory himself. The next morning broke with a kind of eerie stillness, the kind that made veterans glance at the sky as if expecting something to fall from it. A few pilots joked about the heat, others tightened straps on their Mae West vests, but none sensed what was about to hit them. Mallory wiped sweat from his forehead as he checked the last P-38 one more time. Every aircraft now carried his hidden wire trick, a secret modification buried deep inside their control paths like a loaded spring. He hoped he hadn't pushed his luck. He hoped he hadn't doomed anyone. He hoped he was right. Shortly after 0900, the island's warning sirens shattered the air. A shrill, rising scream swept across the jungle and airstrip. Pilots sprinted toward their aircraft as ground crews dove for cover. The radio in the control shack was exploding with calls. "Bandits inbound. Multiple. Low-altitude sweep. Estimated 20+ zeros." It had been weeks since the Japanese had mounted an attack this large, and no one was ready for it. Harlow climbed into his cockpit with a look of grim excitement. "Ev," he shouted over the engines, "if your trick kills me, I'm haunting you." Mallory tried to laugh, but couldn't. His throat was dry. He stepped back as the Lightnings roared to life one after the other, the air vibrating under the power of their twin engines. Dust whipped across the strip as the first aircraft thundered down the runway. The Zeros appeared moments later, sleek, fast silhouettes racing over the treetops like a flock of metallic birds. Their formation widened as they descended toward the airstrip. Tracers streaked across the sky. Explosions rippled across the jungle edges. The battle hit instantly. As the first P-38s lifted off, they met the Japanese formation head-on. Mallory watched helplessly from behind a fuel drum, feeling every engine note, every burst of gunfire. The sky erupted into a swirling chaos of spiraling aircraft and black smoke. Each time a P-38 rolled into a turn, Mallory held his breath, wondering whether his wire trick would hold, or whether he would see a wing shear off and tumble into the sea. Harlow was one of the first to make contact. His Lightning banked hard left, far harder than a P-38 had any business turning. A Zero tried to pull inside him, expecting the usual lag, but the Lightning snapped around with impossible sharpness. Mallory saw it even from the ground, a move no Lightning had ever made before. The Zero overshot. Harlow tightened again, and in seconds the Japanese plane flew right into his line of fire. A burst of .50 caliber rounds tore it apart. A blossom of smoke trailed behind it as the wreckage fell into the jungle canopy. Other pilots began discovering the same thing. Instead of struggling to keep up with the Zero's tight turns, the P-38s were matching them, sometimes even beating them. One Lightning dove through a cloud, rolled sharply right, and sliced into a turning duel with two Zeros. Mallory recognized the pilot's style. It was Lieutenant Crosby, normally conservative, cautious, someone who avoided risky maneuvers. But now Crosby pulled into a turn so steep the P-38's wings almost vibrated off. A Zero tried to clamp onto his tail, but Crosby rolled again, faster than he ever had before, and the Zero skimmed past helplessly. Crosby's cannons roared, and the enemy plane burst into flame. "Holy hell, they can turn," one of the ground crew whispered beside Mallory as they watched. "Since when can Lightnings turn like that?" Mallory didn't answer. His stomach churned. The trick worked, too well. The pilots were beginning to trust the responsiveness instinctively. Pushing their aircraft to limits, Mallory wasn't sure they could survive. Each violent maneuver made him flinch. Each snap roll, each high G pull, made him wonder whether a wire was about to snap violently inside an aircraft and doom it. But the Zeros weren't prepared for what they were facing. Their pilots expected hesitation, lag, the momentary slack that always gave them the advantage. That slack was gone now. The Americans were flying Lightnings that reacted instantly. The Japanese found themselves outmaneuvered in dogfights they had dominated since the beginning of the war. One Zero tried to dive beneath a P-38, then roll into a climbing loop to shake it. But the Lightning followed the move perfectly, slicing through the sky like a blade. The Zero pilot, panicked, tried to break off. Too late. A burst of gunfire ripped across his fuselage and his plane disintegrated. In the control shack, officers stared through binoculars in disbelief. "That shouldn't be possible," one muttered. "P-38s can't turn like that. They don't do that." But they were doing it. In 10 minutes of combat, the Japanese formation began to break. Lightnings pounced on scattered Zeros, chasing them down with confidence none of them had ever felt before. The radio was alive with shouts. "Good kill! Another one down! I can't shake him! Wait, rolling! Holy hell, the plane reacted instantly! Where did that come from?" Mallory heard fear in some of their voices, but something else too. Astonishment. The kind that signaled they were flying machines that suddenly felt alive under them. But combat was never one-sided. A Zero burst out of a cloud bank and stitched bullets across the wing of one Lightning, tearing holes through aluminum. The P-38 spiraled, struggling to recover. Mallory recognized the markings. It belonged to Lieutenant Emerson, one of the youngest pilots. His aircraft dropped dangerously low, smoke pouring from the engine. Mallory felt his chest tighten. If Emerson had to fight the controls to right himself, he would not make it. But then, impossibly, the Lightning steadied itself. The wire trick kept the controls responsive, even while the aircraft was half crippled. Emerson managed to level off and limp back toward the field. As he came in low, Mallory ran toward the runway, heart pounding. The damaged P-38 touched down rough, almost bouncing back into the air. The landing gear groaned. Dust erupted behind it. But the aircraft slid to a stop safely, Emerson climbing out, shaking like a leaf. "Ev!" he shouted across the field the moment he spotted him. "Whatever you did, whatever you touched, that plane saved my life." Mallory didn't know what to say. He opened his mouth, but no words came out. The sky slowly quieted. The last few Zeros fled, black trails of smoke marking their retreat. One by one, the Lightnings returned, some pristine, some scarred by bullets, all flying with a confidence none of them had ever possessed. When Harlow landed, he didn't climb out slowly or swagger like usual. He jumped from the cockpit, ran across the field, and grabbed Mallory in a bear hug that nearly crushed him. "Ev," he said, breathless, "you just rewrote the way we fight. I outturned a Zero, Ev, we all did." Mallory felt the world spinning. He had spent the entire dogfight terrified he had killed someone. Instead, he had helped them win a battle they were supposed to lose. But the officers had seen it too. Men with clipboards, radios, and rank started walking toward the pilots, demanding explanations. Harlow's eyes flicked toward them, then toward Mallory. "This isn't over," Harlow whispered. "Not even close." The officers wanted answers. They wanted to know how 12 Lightnings had just performed maneuvers that defied engineering reports. The pilots exchanged glances. The mechanics looked away. Mallory felt his palms sweating. He was the only one who knew exactly why the planes had changed, and now the entire squadron, maybe even the entire Pacific Theater, was waiting to discover the truth. The airstrip was still vibrating from the last returning Lightning when the officers finally converged on the pilots. Dust swirled around their boots as they demanded explanations, wanting to know how the squadron had just performed maneuvers that P-38s weren't supposed to survive, much less win with. Harlow wiped sweat from his brow, exchanged a brief look with the other pilots, and stepped forward to answer. But Mallory felt his stomach twist. This was the moment he'd feared. If the officers found out he had modified all 12 aircraft without authorization, his career was finished. Worse, if they decided he had jeopardized US Army Air Force's property, the consequences could be far more severe. Harlow started talking fast, filling the space with pilot bravado and half-truths. "We've been studying the Zero's turn patterns. We changed our tactics. We just flew smarter, sir." Another pilot chimed in. "We pushed the aircraft harder than usual. Maybe we've been too cautious before." The officers were unconvinced. One of them, a major with a deep Pacific tan and a short temper, narrowed his eyes. "P-38s don't snap roll like that. They don't lock on that fast, and they don't outturn Zeros. I want the exact reason." Mallory felt the blood drain from his face. The officers turned toward the mechanics. One of them pointed. "You, Mallory, you serviced these aircraft last night. What did you do?" Mallory opened his mouth, choking on words he couldn't bring out. He imagined handcuffs, court-martial papers, a dishonorable discharge, the end of everything. Before he could speak, Harlow stepped forward sharply. "Sir, this mechanic didn't do anything outside regulations." His voice had an edge like a drawn knife. "What changed is us, not him." The other pilots nodded in agreement. It was a lie, a coordinated one, and the officers sensed it. But they also saw the adrenaline in the pilot's eyes, the shock, the pride, the disbelief. Something extraordinary had happened today, and the pilots were closing ranks to protect its source. The officers ordered a full inspection of every P-38 on the field. Mechanics scrambled across the airstrip, unscrewing panels, checking cables, examining linkages. Mallory stood by helplessly, twisting his fingers, waiting for someone to shout his name and drag him away. Every second felt like a lifetime. Then something strange happened. The mechanics didn't find anything, or at least, they didn't report anything. Mallory caught the eye of Sergeant McAllister, his crew chief, who stared at the tension wires inside one of the control compartments for a long, thoughtful moment. He looked back at Mallory. The connection hung between them. McAllister closed the panel quietly and yelled to the officers. "Controls check clean. Nothing unusual here." One by one, mechanics echoed the same. "Clean. Standard tension. Nothing out of spec." The major's face tightened with frustration, but he couldn't argue with a dozen identical reports. There was no smoking gun, no rule broken, no unauthorized part lying on the floor, just a squadron of pilots who had suddenly become dangerous opponents in the air. By late afternoon, the officers left reluctantly to report back to command. As soon as they were out of earshot, the pilots swarmed Mallory. Harlow grabbed him by the shoulders. "Ev, don't you ever scare me like that again," he said, but his voice trembled with pride, not anger. "You saved this squadron. You saved us." Another pilot slapped Mallory on the back so hard he winced. Emerson, the young pilot whose damaged P-38 had barely made it home, stood in front of him, eyes glassy. "You gave me a fighting chance," he whispered. "That's all any of us want." Mallory didn't know how to respond. He felt too small for the praise, too undeserving, too overwhelmed. The wire trick had been something he made on a hunch, an act of desperation. not genius. Yet here they were, alive because of it. That night, long after the sun had dipped behind the jungle and the sky filled with insects and humid darkness, the pilots invited Mallory to sit with them by a small campfire. It felt wrong at first. Mechanics didn't mingle with pilots like this. The divide was unspoken, but real. Machines versus men who flew them. Grease-stained hands versus leather flight gloves. But tonight the rules had shifted, if only slightly. Harlow pushed a mug of coffee toward him. Mallory accepted, unsure of where to look, unsure of what to say. "Tell us the truth," Harlow finally said, voice low so no one else could hear. "What did you do?" Mallory stared into the fire. Then slowly, he explained. The slack in the cables, the millisecond lag, the micro-tension idea, the scrap wire experiments, the midnight modifications, the bleeding fingertips, the fear that he might kill someone, the gamble he had taken without permission. Every man around the fire leaned closer, barely blinking. When Mallory finished, Harlow leaned back with a long exhale. "You mean to tell me the entire Japanese doctrine of turn fighting fell apart today because of a wire the size of a pencil lead?" Mallory swallowed. "Yes, sir." The group burst into stunned laughter, the kind born from shock and relief after surviving something impossible. One of the pilots wiped tears from his eyes. "A stupid wire trick," he chuckled. "You insane, beautiful bastard." Mallory shook his head. "It was reckless," he insisted. "You shouldn't trust it. It could fail." "It held today," Harlow said. "And today we won a fight we were supposed to lose." The fire crackled. The jungle hummed. Distant thunder rolled across the horizon. For the first time since arriving in the Pacific, Mallory felt something settle inside him, the knowledge that he had done something that mattered. Something that would ripple through every pilot who climbed into a P-38 from this day forward. Word of the squadron's sudden change in performance spread fast. Other units began asking questions. Command wanted pilots to describe new tactics. Engineers requested feedback reports. Nobody suspected a mechanic. Nobody imagined the solution could be something so small, so simple, so invisible. But pilots across the region began flying with new confidence, turning harder, rolling sharper, trusting their machines in ways they never had before. Within weeks, the stupid wire trick quietly appeared on more aircraft, never officially documented, never publicly acknowledged, but added in small corners of airstrips by mechanics who just heard it helped. Somewhere in the war's endless haze, a shift had happened. Because once, months earlier, on a soaked airstrip in Guadalcanal, a quiet corporal from Montana refused to accept that his pilots had to die in turning fights. So he bent a rule, then another, and he threaded a wire that changed everything. He remained unknown to most. His name never appeared in dispatches, no medals, no promotion for genius or bravery. But among those 12 pilots from the 339th Squadron, the story was told differently. When someone later asked how they had managed to outturn 0 fighters, the pilots always gave the same answer. "We had a mechanic willing to break the rules." And every time they said it, somewhere far from glory, far from ceremony, Ev Mallory simply finished wiping the grease from his hands and quietly went back to work, because another lightning needed its cables checked, and another pilot's life might depend on what he did next.